This is gonna be a very interesting episode about a very interesting show. Hello everybody, welcome back to Meddling in Antiquity. My name is Teray, and today we're going to be talking about the Netflix original series, The Midnight Gospel. A little bit about the show before I get into breaking down the episodes. So, The Midnight Gospel is a Netflix original animated series produced by a name that a lot of people around my age will recognize as the man who helmed one of the golden age of Cartoon Network's best shows, Adventure Time, and that would be Pendleton Ward. He's the executive producer of this show, and the main character is voiced by podcaster Duncan Trussell. So the concept of The Midnight Gospel is about a young man named Clancy, voiced by Duncan Trussell, who moves to a kind of weird place that he refers to as the Ribbon in space, and decides he wants to become a spacecaster, which is a podcast, a space version of a podcast, essentially. And what he does is he has a simulator that takes him to different worlds, and he can interact with different people. So each episode is essentially formatted like a podcast, but it's animated into this really cool, like, fantastical scenario that takes place in a different world each episode. And there's only 8 episodes in this first season. They're all about 20 minutes with the exception of the very last episode. But it's a really cool show. As soon as I saw Pendleton Ward's name attached to it, I immediately started watching it, and I binged my way through the first 5 episodes in a day because it was just that good. It's a really interesting show because how they use the format is they take these podcast conversations and these animated scenarios and they use them to talk about different kind of metaphysical issues. So it's very much a cycle of talking about spirituality, life, death, and how all of those things kind of intersect. So now that I've explained a bit of the show and what the show's about, let's get into breaking down the episodes. Let's get into it. Getting into the breakdown of the show, starting with episode 1, Taste of the King. The guest on that episode was Dr. Drew Pinsky, who is an addiction expert, and that particular episode was about drug use and meditation, specifically talking about like hallucinogens and stuff like that. And a lot of, there's very much a theme in regards to kind of using meditation and mindful meditation specifically in this particular season, which is really cool. But that particular episode dealt with kind of dealing with drugs and the use of hallucinogens in meditational practices. Episode 2, Officers and Wolves, had the author Anne Lamott and spiritualist Raghu Marcus talking about their thoughts on death, just kind of as an external perspective of somebody looking in at death. I don't want to tell you the scenarios around each episode just because I think to explore the show, to kind of get the feel for it, you have to kind of explore those scenarios as they happen. So I'm not going to tell you what the simulations around each episode were. I'm just going to tell you the content matter. Episode 3, Hundreds at Home, is a episode that focuses on magic and spirituality. And that episode is really interesting because the guest on that was Damien Eccles, who, if you're a true crime fan, you will know as one of the West Memphis 3. So he talks about how he used kind of his interest in magic and ceremonial magic to get him through the 18 years he spent on death row, and how that kind of kept him sane, which is really, really cool and really interesting to hear him talk about that as someone who has been in that prison industrial complex and has left that and is now trying to lead a life outside of it. And that was really, really interesting. That's a really interesting episode. I think that one was one of my favorites, actually, for the whole season. Episode 4, Blinded by My End, is about love and relationships and kind of the cycle of what a relationship looks like. And that is, the guest episode on that is Trudy Goodman, and she is a Dharma teacher and also teaches mindfulness meditation. So that is, as you can see, there's a lot of kind of, the theme of mindfulness and meditation really is all the way woven through the content of this particular season. But that was a really interesting episode because she speaks about love in the context of the idea of mindfulness meditation in your relationships and with your partner. So that was a really cool episode to watch. Annihilation of Joy was also a really interesting episode, and that was kind of about existentialism and reality, and this idea of how an existential crisis can lead you to finding the reality of your situation and in the life you lead outside of that. And the guest for that was Jason Louv, who is a futurist and occultist, calls himself a wizard and a writer. So he talks about it very much in kind of this context of, again, the idea of mindfulness and meditation, and because the idea of existentialism is very broad, and he uses the idea of the futurism, the occultism, and the meditation that comes with both of those things as kind of decreasing the broadness of the existential crisis that so many people have going on in their heads, which is really cool. Episode 6, Vulture with Honor, is an episode where we don't actually really go into a simulation for the whole episode, and it's the first time that that's actually done. But it is about Clancy, Duncan's character that he's created for this, kind of having to face his problems, and there is a guest episode in that, and that is David Nichter, and he's a Buddhist teacher, a composer, an Emmy award-winning composer and musician, and also a meditation guide. So that the latter half of that episode is kind of it's about when there's so much going on in your head and you feel like you're just kind of collapsing in on yourself, to take that time for yourself to stop the thought process and just rest in that particular moment, which is really, I think, a very important thing to kind of make sure you are aware of, because being aware of what's happening in your own head and your own body are very connected, and the importance of making sure that those two things are always speaking to each other is super important. And that, as that episode focuses on kind of emptying that space in your mind and finding that space for yourself. Episode 7, Turtles of the Eclipse, is about death and the history of death. And the guest star for that is Caitlin Doughty, who some people will know as Ask a Mortician on YouTube. And that episode, like, she refers to it as the death industrial complex, and she goes over the history of what death used to be, kind of pre-Civil War, and then post-Civil War, how that has turned into something where the idea of death is something that is now feared, as opposed to something that is just a part of life, which I think is really interesting, and that is a really cool conversation that they had. The final episode, Mouse of Silver, I think is probably the most meaningful of the entire series. It is also the longest episode, and that is taken from audio that was actually recorded in 2013. And this episode is about the cycle of life, aging, death, and the idea of being actively dying. And the guest on this episode was actually Duncan's mother, Deneen Fendig, who died in 2013 of metastatic breast cancer. And they talk about that in the episode. This episode is a good 15 minutes longer than the normal episodes. But it is they have a conversation about Duncan processing the fact that she is dying, and his mother talking about how even as she is dying, she is the most alive she has ever felt. It's a very meaningful episode. I was sobbing through most of the end of the episode just because the visuals are beautiful and the audio is beautiful, and they kind of drop the idea of having Duncan be Clancy and be a different person. It's just an animated conversation between a man and his dying parent. And it was really, it's a really moving episode. It's like probably of all of the episodes in season 1, this one is the most emotionally hard-hitting, simply because it's you're feeling the same things that Duncan is, and you're experiencing that at the same time he's experiencing the fact that, and processing the fact that he's going to lose his mother, that his mother, as they are talking, is also dying. That they have a really, really cool conversation about the psychology of death and how she, as a psychologist, as a professional, is dealing with that as she's processing her own mortality, how she's using that to live better than she has for all the rest of her life. And I thought that was a really, really cool conversation, a really beautiful episode. They have announced that there's going to be a season 2, which I am very excited about. But we'll get into that next. So now that I've finished wrapping up a brief synopsis of the subject matter and the guests per episode, let's get into final thoughts. The Midnight Gospel found a really cool way to have serious conversations without making them too serious. That's something that I really appreciate about the show, because a lot of the conversations and the things that they're talking about in the show can be really difficult to talk about or articulate when you're trying to have them just as regular conversations. And the format in which the Midnight Gospel does this, by using this kind of podcast audio style and mixing it with really cool animated visuals that fit into the situation that they're kind of discussing, that conversation that they're having, is a really smart way to keep people engaged and listening to these conversations that normally they wouldn't necessarily listen to. It gives people a chance to learn something new, something different, and something interesting that they might not have been aware of before, in a format that is consistently keeping them engaged and pulling their focus back into the subject matter of what's actually happening. And that's a really smart way to format a show where they're having discussions about life and death and spirituality in a cool, interesting format. I'm very excited for season 2. I'm excited to see who they bring on. I'm excited to see the conversations and excited to listen to these kind of difficult discussions that they're going to be having. And I'm interested in how there's going to kind of wrap up that catharsis that Clancy, aka Duncan, had in the final episode of season 1. And I'm really excited to see what season 2 of The Midnight Gospel has in store. So that about wraps us up for this episode of Socio-Political Smackdown. I will see everybody, barring any crazy world-shattering events, on Wednesday for One-Off Wonders. Bye.